Recently, I decided to replay Paper Mario for the Nintendo 64, and I wanted to kind of revisit a video that I made a while back talking about the game and see how my opinions have changed over time. Especially because the video I made before was more so me summarizing what happens in the game versus what my actual thoughts on what happens is. So if you are unfamiliar, what is Paper Mario? Well, one console generation before, Nintendo and Square Enix worked together to make Super Mario RPG, which was, well, an RPG take on the Mario franchise. It was incredibly accessible, especially compared to many of the other RPG franchises of the time, games like Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, other things like that. It was a really unique game, giving us brand new characters like Geno and Mallow to the Mario franchise, characters who wouldn't really return anytime in the future. The battle system of that game was easy enough to understand to pull newcomers in, but it still had enough complexity to keep RPG fans engaged enough throughout the experience. Anyway, after Super Mario RPG, the Mario RPG series would kind of branch out into two different paths going forward, that primarily being Mario and Luigi on handheld consoles and Paper Mario on the home Nintendo systems. So what is it that makes these two different sub-Mario RPG series different from one another? So while there are definitely ways that these games are similar, generally speaking, Paper Mario tends to be more of a traditional RPG type of game, whereas the Mario and Luigi games lean more so into action RPG. And I should probably note that the first two Paper Mario games are what I'm mainly referring to. Super Paper Mario and onward kind of do their own thing compared to where the series started. But with the first two Paper Mario games, you have to rely a lot on badges and other little small perks that you have to strategically use in order to enhance your abilities in battle. Whereas in something like Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga, you have a set amount of abilities that you are able to do in battle, of course assuming that you have enough bros points in order to, well, utilize them. In the Mario and Luigi games, Mario and Luigi each have their own dedicated button that you use to control them, whereas in the early Paper Mario games you are just controlling Mario with your partner kind of being like a sub-character in battle. Those are just a few basic differences between them. They both have a lot of similarities as well. They're both generally very light and comedic in tone. You level up through battling, you have boss fights, all the other normal stuff that you might find in an RPG game. So for the sake of this video, let's just forget that Mario and Luigi exist. We're just going to focus on Paper Mario and specifically the first two games in the series because they're the two most similar compared to what came after. And what I found very interesting, especially after replaying the original Paper Mario, is that a common perspective that people have, and one that I held for a long time, was that Paper Mario the Thousand Year Door was just better than the original in like every single way imaginable. The battle system of the Thousand Year Door is better, the set pieces of the Thousand Year Door are better, the music is better, the characters are better, just everything across the board is better in the Thousand Year Door. That's just what a very common point of view is to have. And before I start comparing these two games, I should probably also point out that I was replaying the Thousand Year Door through the Switch remake, and that has its own slight differences from the original, but for the most part, my comparisons generally can be applied to the originals of both games. For one thing, from what I noticed, it felt like I could traverse the world in the original Paper Mario much quicker than the Thousand Year Door. This is primarily because of the spin move that you're able to use, and there's even a badge in the game that increases the distance of which your spin move actually gets you across the overworld every single time you use it, and there's no cooldown or anything, so it does make being able to traverse the world feel a little bit more fluid. In the Thousand Year Door, there isn't really any way to go faster until Chapter 3 whenever you unlock Yoshi as a partner, so that is one slight thing that I noticed I preferred about the original that before I just kind of completely forgot about. One thing that I remember hating about the original Paper Mario though is that the prologue sucks. I do really like this game, but the prologue can definitely feel sluggish to go through, especially because you don't even unlock action commands until Twink gives them to you later on. This means that for the first bunch of enemies that you fight, you're not able to do anything interactive with the battle, like whenever you say jump on them, you know, pressing A at the right time in order to boost the damage that you do. It just makes it much more basic and rudimentary feeling, which just inevitably makes it less fun. I will say that during the prologue of the original game. There are some really adorable character interactions, but that's mainly a pro whenever it's your first time playing the game. On repeated playthroughs, that doesn't really stick out as much. However, to give a point right back to Paper Mario, I really like how in the original game, whenever you fight Bowser for the first time, he fucks you up. In terms of difficulty, Paper Mario is a really fun case because for the most part the game isn't that hard until you reach chapter 6 and you fight Huff and Puff. Up until that point, the game is relatively chill. You may have a few somewhat difficult encounters depending on how you use your badges, how much you level up and everything, but it's definitely manageable up to that point. But then once you fight Huff and Puff, shit just hits the fan. In terms of the actual chapters that you play through in both Paper Mario and The Thousand Year Door, both games definitely have their highs and lows. I would say in Paper Mario, the highs and lows are more pronounced. Generally the formula goes, if the chapter is an even number, then it's not good. Chapter 1 is pretty chill in this game. I think that the Koopa Bros are a pretty adorable boss for the fortress that you go through, and the puzzle of that fortress, it kind of feels aesthetically like a Zelda dungeon, which I think is pretty cool. Chapter 2 is the best out of these even chapters that aren't good, although I still don't like it. The first portion has you collecting these 4 different envelopes in order to get Parakarry to, you know, help you on your journey, since Parakarry is kind of required in order to traverse across the mountains. This part is pretty charming, especially because these envelopes actually go out to various characters throughout the game, and later on in the game it actually lets you read some of these letters from the characters, which I think is so cool, but that's just kind of aside the point. The rest of chapter 2 is definitely not my favorite though. The bulk of it is the Dry Desert, which is this large 7x7 grid where there are various different rooms where you're able to get like lost through various things like twisters and just random puzzles and stuff. Thankfully, for the most part, you're able to kind of ignore the various puzzles in the Dry Desert, although completing them does give you various things like badges and items. That doesn't help the fact that the enemies that you fight in this region are very annoying, and it's an incredibly drab and boring section to look at visually. I don't really like how the chapter ends because the dungeon that caps off the chapter is very repetitive. A lot of the rooms just consist of like, alright, lower the sand into the room on the bottom of this room so that way a doorway is accessible, and then do this again later on in the dungeon. It's not a terrible dungeon, and the boss that you fight is pretty funny, but you know, it's just one of the things that doesn't really stick out to me very much. Thankfully though, chapter 3 is Fire. This is the Forever Forest chapter, which is kind of like this game's take on something like the Lost Woods from The Legend of Zelda. Essentially, there are various different rooms, and each one has one correct path for you to take, and if you take the wrong one, then it kind of sends you right back to the very first room that you started in. The puzzle here is easy enough to be understandable to the player, but difficult enough to make it engaging to go through, and I find this pretty cool and just interesting of an area to look at in general. I always like these spooky areas in Paper Mario games. The mansion where you eventually unlock Bo is also really fun. The puzzle here is actually pretty well designed and kind of requires you to think on your feet. And then the entire area with Gusty Gulch is filled with great music, and Teleblubba, which is like one of my favorite villains in the entire Mario RPG canon. I'm not a very big fan of Chapter 4, which I feel like isn't going to be that hot of a take. Maybe I'm wrong though. I do like the aspect of how you are returning some items to various characters in Toad Town. It kind of helps you feel like a good Samaritan while playing the game, so that's a cool feature. There are fun characters here, and I really like Watt as a partner, but for the most part, this is just a very tedious chapter to go through with some of the backtracking involved, although I will say I do like General Guy as a boss for this chapter. Chapter 5 is the Rescue Mission chapter, where we have the Fearsome Five going missing in the dense Yoshi's Island jungle, and you have to go save them. For the most part, while this section was definitely a bit more difficult with the enemies that you fight, I found it to be pretty fun and engaging with the puzzle solving with finding each of the Fearsome Five members, and Sushi is a really fun partner as well. Easily one of the highlights of this chapter is also Colorado, because he constantly is just giving one-liners, because he's also looking for this specific treasure that he ends up not even getting on his own. Not to spoil, but the game's also been out for like, what, 30 years now? The second portion of the chapter, where you go into the volcano, for the most part is pretty fun, except for the boss. Specifically, if you're playing this game on the Nintendo Switch, because it becomes an absolute misery of an experience. For some reason, the emulation on Nintendo Classics is miserable during this boss fight. It just becomes completely laggy and almost like borderline impossible to properly time your attacks, but I did prevail both on my original and my most recent playthrough. And then we got Chapter 6, which is by far the worst chapter in the game. Even before you actually get to the chapter is not fun, because essentially, if you did not collect the 4 different flower seeds from prior in the game, which you probably didn't because the game wasn't really telling you to do that, then you have to backtrack to Chapter 3, Chapter 2, Toad Town itself, and back over to Chapter 5, where you can actually get all 4 flower seeds, which allow you to go into flower fields. This is one of those fetch quest chapters where you basically are tasked with getting one thing, then you get it, then you're prompted to get another thing, then you get that thing, then you bring that thing back to another character, then you have to get another thing, and then it just goes on and on. Thankfully, I think Chapter 7 is probably the best chapter in the entire game. For starters, it starts out with a very fun murder mystery, which it is kind of the perfect length because the murder mystery does not last long at all, and if it's your first playthrough and you don't even know how to solve it, it isn't super difficult either. The actual dungeon that you solve as well is incredibly memorable and atmospheric, and I like it quite a bit. And then you fight the Crystal King, which is another one of those pretty difficult boss fights that you fight throughout the game. So all in all, this video isn't specifically meant to be a comparison between Paper Mario and the Thousand Year Door, even though I know I kind of said that earlier in the video. More so, this is meant to be a video about whether Paper Mario for the Nintendo 64 is still worth coming back to in today's day and age, of course assuming that the game doesn't get remade sometime in the future. And while I would still say that I prefer the Thousand Year Door and Super Paper Mario more, in terms of just like coming back to the experience and the general vibe of the story and everything, Paper Mario for the 64 is actually really fun. There's so many like random side characters that'll stick in your head even after playing the game, whether it be, you know, Colorado as mentioned before, or Junior Troopa. I hate that guy. You have to fight him like every single chapter and he sucks. I think if you are someone that hasn't played a Mario RPG game, it is a pretty good place to start, especially with some of the other early games that add a little bit more nuance to the experience. For example, whenever it comes to battling, the Thousand Year Door has so many more little things going on, even just something as small as interacting with the crowd. There's just a lot more to think about, so I do think that Paper Mario, the original one, is probably better to start out with before jumping into that experience. So in terms of has the game held up? Yeah, I would say thumbs up. It's fun. It definitely has its problems, but I still had a smile on my face as I replayed the game. Except for Flower Fields, I didn't have a smile then. So thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe and like the video, as that's the best way to support the channel. Stay tuned for my thoughts on Donkey Kong Bonanza, because much like many other people, I have been honestly having a hard time putting that game down, so I'm definitely gonna have some stuff coming out about that. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and as always, peace out.